Well, I think the role of weapons governance in ensuring positive humanitarian outcomes is an essential one. We've seen historically the chaotic impacts of weapons proliferation around the world, for example, in the conflict between Iran and Iraq in the 80s, where there were many weapons suppliers supplying both sides in that conflict, and also with the dispersal of weapons stocks from the Eastern Europe on the breakup of the Soviet Union. Since then, we have seen steps to try and regulate this environment, and we saw the Programme of Action on Small Arms and more recently the adoption of the Arms Trade Treaty that is trying to set out a framework to control the supply of weapons and to dampen the human rights impact of those weapons in conflict zones around the world. Well, the risks that weapons, particularly when there's poor governance, pose to humanitarian actors is fundamental. We see it in ongoing conflicts across the world, particularly in the Middle East, where we've seen the brutal conflicts in Syria and now in Yemen. We've also seen armed groups such as ISIS rampaging through Syria and Iraq and causing enormous destruction, the displacement of millions and the deaths and injuries of hundreds of thousands of civilians across the region. What we've seen in those situations is different suppliers continuing to supply multiple systems, different types of weapon systems, from very small arms, pistols, to tanks, to combat aircraft, knowing that those systems are being misused. They're being misused to target civilian infrastructure such as hospitals, schools, mosques, and recently in Yemen, a school bus and hotels, water wells and so forth. And this is where weapons governance needs to play a much stronger role to stress that irresponsible transfers of weapons that should in theory be barred by the legally binding Arms Trade Treaty should be suspended. And what we're seeing in terms of the current conflict in Yemen, many member states across the EU are starting to take steps, but other countries, other states, unfortunately are continuing to supply even where there's clear evidence of human rights harm. I think participants in this conference hopefully will be able to achieve a greater understanding of the issue and also cross-fertilisation of different ideas and different areas of work. From my perspective, I've generally been talking to people who are closely allied to the disarmament movement, both in Geneva and New York, that essentially talk the same language, but here I've had the interesting experience of talking to people in different fields, people who are dealing specifically with technological advances in artificial intelligence, who are also working on themes such as corruption, and also looking at the regulation of outer space. And for me, that's been an eye-opener that to sort of get me out of my silo to see that there are many other actors who are facing similar problems in different environments and different regulatory frameworks. And hopefully through this dialogue we'll be able to create better frameworks and understandings for strengthening weapons governance.